Buenas noches, good evening, everybody. My name is Alberto Hernández. I'm one of the newer faces at the Centro. I'm the Associate Director for Library and Archives. It's a real pleasure here to open tonight's event, the Centro's Meet the Author book party, Reggaeton and Anthology, by our very own Raquel Rivera, together with Wayne Marshall and Deborah Pacini Hernández. Before we begin, and on behalf of the Director of the Centro, Elvin Melendez, he wants to welcome you all, bienvenidos a todos, and thanks for joining us tonight. I have to make a brief announcement. At the reception table, we have some applications on how to become a Centro collaborator. We're looking for students, community members, teachers, and educators to help us discover and capture some of our heritage here in El Barrio, here in New York City and in the nation. We have three important application forms. One is for heritage research. The other one is for Voices, a new e-journal magazine. And also the one for the summer workshops for volunteers who want to help us organizing the archives in the Centro archives. Without further ado, please welcome Raquel Rivera. She's our Centro researcher extraordinaire and also the co-editor of Reggaeton.
To present this book today. I want to thank my co-editors, Wayne Marshall and Deborah Pacini Hernández. I've heard that co-editing a book can be really difficult, that folks get into fights, but this was an amazing, and I'm not just saying it because they're here, for real. It was a really pleasurable experience. So the first thing I want to do is recognize them. I want to thank you all for being here and sharing this with us. And I also want to thank Centro for all the logistical support, financial support. Because I was here, I was able to dedicate myself really to finishing up this volume. So thank you to Centro also for hosting this event, and particularly Ibelis Rosario Natal and Alicia Rodriguez, who have been working hard at making this happen. So thank you very much as well. And the last thing I want to mention is that I have donated all the materials that I've been collecting for 15 years on hip hop and reggaeton to the Centro archives. And in a month, it'll be available. So please tell your friends, your students, that all that material is going to be available. And hopefully soon it'll be on the web also, at least some of it, or the guides to the collection at least. So in about a month, check for that. So the first person that I want to invite to speak is my co-editor, Deborah Pacini Hernández, who will tell you a little bit about how this collection came about. She's a professor at Tufts University, director of the American Studies and Latino Studies Department. So welcome, Deborah.
I'm not going to talk for very long. Can you hear? Is this on? No. Okay, you want me to get up? Okay. Hello. Hi, and so I'm not going to talk for very long. Raquel asked me to talk about the genesis of the book. You know, where, you know, how the idea of the book came from, and you know how it evolved. And so I will be brief. The book, it's amazing. I was thinking about it. It's taken 5 years since the idea of this book first came about. Raquel was at Tufts University as a Mellon Fellow, where I was, and she and I were supposed to be collaborating. In those days, the Mellon Fellows required some kind of collaboration, and so she and I had some other idea that we were working on, but the other requirement was that we teach a course together. We taught a course called we co-taught a course called Music, Blackness, and Caribbean Latinos, and this is in 2005. And what we found, that was the year that reggaeton really exploded, at least in Boston. I suppose in New York it's probably been happening for a little longer than that. But the students, that's all they wanted to talk about, and it was so interesting. It just brought together so many different important ideas and issues. It were intersecting in such interesting ways. And at that point, we said, you know, Raquel said, no, someone should write a book. We should do something, you know. She wasn't ready. She didn't want to do it, and I certainly didn't. I was about to go on sabbatical, and I was starting the process of writing my own book. So that was that. And I went off on sabbatical, and she called me about 2 months later and said, you know, we really should do some kind of an edited, co-edited anthology, just really important. And, you know, it was in the middle of writing my own book at that moment, but there were so many reasons for wanting to participate in this. For one thing, of course, working with Raquel. Secondly, I had a long interest in, you know, the circulation of musics in the Caribbean. For a long time, reggaeton, you know, which, as you can tell, it's not my music. I'm a grandmother, but nonetheless, there's, you know, it was very interesting to me. And of course, I'd been working in the Caribbean for many, many years, and so I said, okay, and basically put my own book aside for a while, and we put out a call for papers, hoping to bring together some, you know, really interesting voices on all of the topics that, you know, one might imagine that we felt should be covered in a scholarly way, but in an interesting, informative, with lots of different voices talking about reggaeton in terms of race and gender, dance, history, aesthetics, etc. So meanwhile, I was on sabbatical. Raquel was back at Tufts still, and she organized a symposium on reggaeton. And actually, she had just read an article in the Boston Phoenix by one Wayne Marshall, which she read, and she said, this is an amazing article. And so she invited him to the symposium, and then called me up afterward and said, he's amazing. And so then, and I think he's gonna submit a paper for the book. So application, you know, the proposal came in, and it was really interesting, and at that point it was clear, and we said, okay, this guy's, you know, we invited Wayne to join the editorial collective at that point. I had never met him. Raquel was still in Boston at that point. And so as she said, you know, the work was just amazing, the way that you know, we came together, and actually in different places. I mean, Raquel, once she left, she was in New York here at Centro. Wayne was in Boston, I was in Boston. And the fact of the matter is, this is the first time we've ever been in a room together. It's tonight. So it's, and it's taken, you know, a really long time. I was thinking also that from the time I met Wayne to now, he now has 2 children. He just had a little baby girl not so long ago. So it's been a long time, but it was amazing. And now, as far as my own participation, other than helping out with the editorial stuff that goes into a volume, when the proposals came in, since I had a long interest in Dominicans and their music, I was really hoping that somebody would propose a paper that would say something about where were Dominicans, because since they were sharing spaces both in Puerto Rico and here, and were also part of that Caribbean circuit of music. And nobody said anything about it, and so at that point, I said, okay, I'll step up to the plate and I'll do it. And so I, you know, with a lot of help from my friends, Raquel and Wayne, who helped me out, Jorge Duani, who's amazing also, with materials. And so that's, you know, that's kind of the genesis of the book. Now, since Raquel's been here, I'm really grateful for the Centro also, you know, for providing her with the support for this, because the fact is, even though the work was shared, Raquel really, really did, she was the nerve center of this, and she really held the book, and she deserves, you know, a special appreciation for what she did for this book. And in addition to that, sort of mustering her resources, her considerable resources and friends who brought some of the different voices into this book, you know, the artists, the photographers, particularly Miguel Luciano with that gorgeous cover, you know, that cover that just pops. I mean, it's just amazing. And you know, in summary, you know, that's all I have to say is I'm just so proud to be a part of this volume and to be a part of, you know, the whole effort. And thank you all for being here.
Next, I would like to invite Juan Flores, who has been my mentor and my friend for many years. And he also wrote the foreword to the volume. We're really grateful to him for writing that piece. He's a professor at NYU at the Department for Social and Cultural Analysis.
Thanks for coming. Thank you to Raquel and Debbie and Wayne for this fabulous book. I just want to say thank you and congratulations for just an incredible piece of work. I've read through it at various stages in its life and kept seeing it growing and growing and becoming more and more important and more needed as we face classrooms of students for whom reggaeton is the main form of music that they grew up with. It's not even hip-hop anymore. You know, I thought hip-hop was the latest thing, and before you know it, you grow out of hip-hop and you're at something new, and what's this? You know, how do you understand this thing? And so it really is a historic book, and we're in a historic moment right now as we welcome it to life. The new Raquel's new baby, or Wayne's new baby, or Debbie's new grandbaby, or my new grandchild, you know, whatever. But it's definitely the birth of something really, really important. And I say that I don't say that lightly, because this is the first book on reggaeton, and reggaeton is the first musical genre in the new millennium. It's the genre of our generation, the generation that we live in right now. And how do we get a handle on that? How do we understand this complex thing with this very weird name? I mean, the thing itself is even weirder than the name, in trying to get a handle on it, that is, and understand it, and get a sense of why this is the style of our generation. And it's also historic because it shows once again how central music is, and understanding music in knowing something about the society we live in, and knowing something about ourselves. And it really serves, and this book shows it so well, that music is a window on the world, and it's a mirror of ourselves. It shows us about it, tells us a lot about ourselves. It's also a historic book because it validates popular music, that is music of the people and music of the communities that we live in, that we come from, that we're part of, and shows that it can be a subject of serious scholarly study, because most of the time this kind of expression only finds a rather shallow, superficial analysis, cliches in journalistic pieces and so forth, and doesn't get the kind of serious, deep look that you find in this book, and that it's so deserving of. So rather than just a bunch of Wikipedia entries, we have here people really looking at it carefully from a lot of different angles. And I think that one of the beauties of the book is that it takes so many different approaches and looks at it from so many different places and ways and perspectives and countries and disciplines and methodologies and ideologies, that it's just so rich, going from one to the other. And when you finish one piece, you say, what's next? What's next? And your mouth waters to get on to the next one. And I think that it's you'll be amazed when you think reggaeton to find the kind of language and complexity of thinking that goes into figuring it all out and explaining it to us and to ourselves. One review, and there's already reviews of it, so the book is just out of the press, but it already is developing a history. One of them says that it calls it a nerdy look at a by no means nerdy genre. You know, so it's a kind of interesting disconnect between the evident simplicity of it and sort of everydayness of the thing, and how thick the analysis can get in terms of issues of politics and of race and of gender and of nationality and cultural identities and dance and the politics of dance and so many other things that you see here. So that even in their introduction, which the three co-editors wrote together, they break it up into sections where it shows how the different things that you need to do just in order to begin to approach it and break down what are the different angles on it. They have a part called naming reggaeton, where the very spelling of the word has a politics to it. And do you use that accent or not? Do you use the Spanish orthographic usage or not? All of those become questions that have to be thought about and studied and understood in a nuanced kind of a way, so that you don't rule anything out too quickly, and you don't just think it's a mistake somehow because it's written in a certain way, or the accent's there or not there. So that those things which seem to be so simple take on an incredible importance, unbeknownst to us when we just go about our daily lives. There's reggaeton, and we sort of brush it off as something that's like just having breakfast or something. And then so after naming comes defining, and defining comes valuing, and if the valuing comes mapping, and then comes the task of anthologizing and reading the reggaeton. How do you read reggaeton and what it means? So it's like a lot of things that we take for granted. It's a very intricate subject. think about it, when you take the trouble to think about it. And it's deceptively complex precisely because it seems to be so simple. Because a lot of people just call it, oh, it's just one more stage of hip hop, or it's just a combination of reggae and hip hop, or it's just reggae en español. I've heard people say it's just reggae en español, not knowing that there is such a thing as reggae en español, which is not reggaeton. It's just Jamaican dancehall in Spanish, you know, or something like that. Or it's Panamanian, you know, and it did it all already, you know, and it's all finished, you know. And then we see how complicated it is beyond that of the supposed original pioneering founders of it. So this book really shows how much more complex it is, and how you have to actually stand in a lot of different places in order to approach it. You have to be in New York, and you have to be in San Juan, and you have to be in Santo Domingo, and you have to be in Panama City, and you have to be in Miami, and you have to be in Havana, you have to be in Boston, you have to be in all these places, and that's kind of what I think, and I try to bring it out in my little comment at the beginning of the book, that it's really a transnational music from the get-go. It's not something that becomes just diffused around and disseminated to all different parts. It's something where you can't pinpoint the place of origin, because it has multiple places of origin. It emerges in different ways and in different stages and different aspects of it in different parts of the world, which are all, of course, symbiotically in connection with each other, and none of them are really separate from them. And it's also a kind of complex thing, aside from this place of question of origins and location, because it's just in the way that we think about music, it's been called by someone both mainstream and marginal at the same time, you know, and that's kind of an interesting concept. You usually think it's either one or the other, but with reggaeton, you have an aspect of reggaeton that's very mainstream, and at the same time, its origin, especially in Puerto Rico, are very marginal. It's underground, coming above ground, basically, and that makes it also very interesting. And Wayne's and other pieces, Wayne's really good first piece in the book, which is such a wonderful step in to the whole subject, show that there was, aside from the mainstream and marginal reality of it, there was also a very clear and unfortunately all too familiar development from margin to mainstream, with heavy-duty consequences in terms of the politics and the music and the lyrics and every other aspect of it. And he shows really well how the movement from the margin, where it was considered música negra, to the mainstream became, it was a making of it pan-Latino music. So it moved from black to Latino, and it excised the black dimension, much to the objection of a lot of the practitioners of reggaeton, who then bowed out and said, no, I'm not going there, in spite of the seduction of commercial success. So those are some of the complexities that I noticed, and there are many, many more. But I think probably the most interesting and central one is this multi-local, this different place kind of origin of the thing, and the complex relationship between these different locations. And it shows, even though it can very rightfully be celebrated as música puertorriqueña, as Puerto Rican music, nevertheless it shows something that has more graphically than ever before, that's been true of Puerto Rican and any other native or indigenous music, and that is that there's no such thing as a music that's totally only of one place. It's always from multiple places. It's always the emergence of new forms and genres is always a result of the infusion of things from supposedly outside of the nation. You know, so it's that inside-outside phenomenon that's always true. It was true of Bombay. It was true of dimensions of música jíbara and other forms that are supposedly indigenous. But here it's really true, really clearly, more clearly than ever before. You can see how the national music, the music that's typical of a certain generation in the history of the nation, is at the same time a music that comes from outside, that mixes with things that are inside. And that's, I think, a really, really important lesson. And we get that from the book. And finally, I just think that I want to, call attention to the work itself that went into this book, the example that this book sets of collective work, of people working together, and people aware that no one person or no one academic field or discipline or no one method or approach or ideological point of view is going to be able to get a handle on something like this, that you have to work together with other people. And you have to work with people who are looking at the same phenomenon from different perspectives, so that it marshals not only it marshals not only cultural studies scholars and active students of race relations, music critics, journalists, women's and queer studies perspectives, musicians, musicologists, ethnomusicologists, professors, students, producers, fans, and a newfound breed of reggaetonologists. But it also, interestingly, brings in the visual arts in a very ingenious kind of way. The cover is just an enticement into the rest of the book, but I invite you to go and look at some of the other iconography, both of Miguel, Luciano, and others that are in the book, and really gives another whole dimension that amplifies on Miguel's Plantanium, as he calls it, Plantanium Platinum series, as illustrated on the front cover of the book. So that anyway, I just think that, and I followed the hard work that Debbie mentioned about how Raquel worked, and I'm sure that both Debbie and Wayne also worked really hard and dedicated themselves long hours and days and weeks of challenging and tedious work. And those others of you who have done edited volumes know that it's not fun and games. It's a lot of work. I know that Francis Negrón, who's going to speak to us as well, has also done that kind of work, and it really is something that deserves our huge respect. And so for me, it's just an honor and a privilege that these distinguished editors and accomplished people and talented people have asked me to have something to do with this, and I feel really thrilled that some of it rubs off by association on me. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and let's welcome and cheer the editors of the
Next up is another one of our contributors to the book, Frances Negrón Muntaner. She's a professor at Columbia University, a filmmaker, and an author. And her piece in the book is called Poetry of Filth, the post-reggaetonic lyrics of Calle 13.
Thank you, first of all, to the editors, for Hunter, for the Center for Rican Studies, for having this. Actually, when Raquel talked to me about it, I thought my piece was too weird for the collection. I was floored when she told me that it wasn't. But my piece began as a question that Juan Duchesne posed when he was editing a special issue of Revista Iberoamericana. And the question was pretty simple. It was, what is the most important verbal event, that was the word, verbal event, that has taken place in Puerto Rico over the last 2 decades? I didn't have to think about it too long before I said reggaeton. And the beginning of my chapter then begins the answer to this question. From its emergence in the 1980s, reggaeton has been generally regarded as cultural trash by the state, the majority of intellectuals, and most of the so-called general public. This is the case because reggaeton speaks to what good taste considers garbage. That is, the genre's main subject is sex. And also because it has been mainly associated and consumed by a trashy group with little social prestige, the Puerto Rican lower classes. But since there's no real contradiction between trash and culture, this dichotomy is of little use when it comes to appreciating reggaeton. Although critics have repeatedly characterized the genre as being pure noise without any aesthetic value, I quote, filth and degeneration posing as art, reggaeton's cultural record is impressive. Not only has reggaeton produced a new sound by fusing Black Atlantic genres such as dancehall and hip-hop, it also constitutes the most important verbal event that has taken place in and from Puerto Rico in the last 2 decades. Then my piece basically takes Calle 13 as a case study, and the argument proceeds twofold. One, that part of the vitality of Calle 13's work are what I would call its clear surrealist tendencies. With the purpose of avoiding the cliches of everyday speech, music, history, and literature, Calle 13 breaks down linguistic structures and substitutes words by their extended definitions or associations in order to free them from their social and moral charge. In this way, if the average reggaeton singer refers to a desired woman's buttocks as a puro, Residente attempts to impress her by saying that she possesses esos dos cachetes llenos de musculatura, or a zona nalgable acoginable. And if the typical rapper says, Hoy es noche de sexo, voy a devorarte, nena linda. Residente counterattacks with, yo quiero beber agua de ese pozo, chocolatoso, embriagarme con tu caldo de oso. At the same time, Calle 13's surrealism differs from the European kind. If André Breton and his close collaborators had to create surrealist conditions and situations in post-war Europe, Calle 13, as those other surrealists of the American continent, Frida Kahlo, Wilfredo Lamb, M.S. Serre, is the product of a historical moment and a geopolitical context in which the surreal, that is, the juxtaposition of arguably incongruous elements, is not an exception. In this sense, what Calle 13 offers his moderno listeners, as Residente would say, is not a new version of the surrealist project. Rather, the group recycles and incorporates world surrealist discoveries onto a popular poetics that, given its themes, politics, and style, we could call poesía de porquería, or poetry of filth. In part, Calle 13's poetry of filth is a call to rethink what so-called urban music can be, underscoring the capacity of wordplay and fusions of musical genres to make up alternative worlds. Yet, even further, it is a political proposition that redefines the post-reggaeton poet as a new intellectual figure, whose main function is to humorously manage, renew, and radicalize corporeal, cultural, political, and media garbage. This accounts for why in Calle 13's world, the only truly enjoyable things in life are puerco, sucio, como de inodoro. And also why the enemies of enjoyment and desire are not always identified with any particular nationality or social class, but with the more universal puercos. Those despicable beings, not always cops, that sell themselves to the highest bidder and or abuse the weakest. Como robar el desayuno a un tecato. Eso es de puerco. Critical to the argument, the trash that grounds Calle 13's poetry is reggaeton. As Residente once told a Latina magazine reporter, Calle 13 will mostly be remembered for having transformed reggaeton at a time when it was doing the same porquería. By porquería, Residente specifically refers to the fact that in order to supply the market, most of the music produced after Daddy Yankee's global hit Gasolina used the same rhythm and the same lyrical repertoire of Yo te quiero mami clichés. In order to renew reggaeton, or in Residente's terms, run over tu mierda con mi super trooper, Calle 13 broke the rules of the commercial game by transforming the expectations of the public and turning reggaeton's mainstream porquería into a different poetics. Thematically, the poetics of Calle 13 center on the filth of the body and the trash of desire. Although media industry fans still wonder why the group indulges in so much porquería, the attention to the body and its biological functions is not fortuitous. The emphasis is part of a long tradition of symbolic insurrection, from Renaissance writer François Rabelais in his novel Gargantua and Pantagruel to the DJs of Jamaican dancehall. And through word, image, and our music, exalt the body as a living organism to celebrate the victory of the people over static social hierarchies and death. This is why Calle 13's body is always eating with a cutlery like Vikings, spitting gargajos, meando territorio. While desire is the main subject of Calle 13, Residente's rap is also symptomatic of the trash of politics, the garbage of the press, and TV filth. Through turning publicity trash into trashy commentary, for instance, Calle 13 calls attention to the surreal porquería of living in 21st century Puerto Rico. And what exactly does this crappiness consist of? For Calle 13, it's about racist practices and class hierarchies that are camouflaged and reorganized but not eradicated. It's about the political corruption invading every pore of the body politic that results in everyday life shit like an incompetent government, a biased press, and bad public services. It's also about a political subordination of the Puerto Rican elites to Washington that produces the experimental excess of the FBI killing Filiberto Ojeda Rio on September 23, 2005, as addressed in Calle 13's first song, Querido FBI. Yet, in this song, which succeeds like no other in incorporating the surrealist practice of a spontaneous monologue, having been written, produced, and disseminated via internet only 30 hours after the assassination of Ojeda Rios, Residente seems to literally spit out his words as if he was possessed by the most unbearable political poison. Although many have understood Querido FBI as the group's most political intervention for its mention of a pro-independence leader, and criticism of the U.S. federal government, I would suggest the song's greater political contribution may well be the centrality given to disgust and verbal insurrection as an indispensable form of social protest. In sum, with Residente, the reggaeton poet acts as a surreal part of the body politics digestive system. Furthermore, the verbal art of Calle 13 recognizes that the best thing to do with porqueria is to push it out like a gargajo, in order to show how power operates not only through the state apparatus, but also, and even more effectively, through all of our being. By reconceptualizing politics in this way, Calle 13 implies that the biggest challenge facing all of us is not colonialism or the global order as such. Rather, it is something simultaneously simpler and more complex. How to creatively and humorously handle the crap of which we are made of, and the enormous amount of physical and symbolic waste that falls upon us each day. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Wayne Marshall, one of the co-editors. He's been teaching most recently at Brandeis University, and his piece in the anthology is titled From Música Negra to Reggaeton Latino, The Cultural Politics of Nation, Migration, and Commercialization.
I'm going to stand here because I need to operate my machine. One of the things I'm going to do is play a little bit of audio and video to enliven our presentation a little bit. But I also want to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from, about how I come into this project, and how I come into reggaeton, in a sense. Coming from lots of places. I'm coming from Boston, from Cambridge more specifically, and one of the things I want to note is that in the early 1990s, when the sort of roots of, or the seeds of reggaeton were being sown in, makeshift house parties in San Juan, they were dancing to the same stuff I was dancing to in Cambridge, which was hip hop and dancehall reggae and some R&B and some pop mixed in. But one of the interesting things about going to a high school dance at that time was a sort of somehow collectively known response, where once the dance hall tracks were put on, everybody would sort of get together in a big massive circle, and the dancing would assume a slightly different shape than it was assuming before. And that kind of response to these rhythms in particular is part of what led me into the story. I also come to this as an ethnomusicologist, and I'm very interested in how music, how patterns of sound make sense to us, how they both reflect the world, as Juan Flores was saying a minute ago, but also I think how they can inform our world, and how they inform our sense of who we are, how they allow us to draw and redraw the lines of community. And that's sort of where my research was before reggaeton. I did my dissertation on the interplay between hip hop and reggae, dancehall reggae in Jamaica, and very much interested in migration from Jamaica to New York, in the way that hip hop and other American mass media migrated down to Jamaica, and in the ways that kids in Kingston or kids in Brooklyn would sort of wrestle with these different sonic signifiers in terms of how they wanted to position themselves, to draw the lines of community, so to speak. Back in Boston in 2003, after I returned from 6 months of field research in Kingston, I was doing digital music workshops. I'm also a producer, I'm also a DJ. In fact, we're doing an after party tonight at APT in the Meatpacking District at a weekly Latin night called Que Bajo, and I'm going to be dropping a very heavy reggaeton set at about midnight. So it's free. Come on out if you want to sort of embody the anthology. At any rate, I was giving basically beat-making workshops in Roxbury and Dorchester, and also in Lowell, Massachusetts, places that do have significant Latino populations. And I'd end up in these funny situations where, I'd say to a kid, well, do you want to make a hip-hop beat? Do you want to make a reggae rhythm? Tell me what you want, and I'll sort of get you started. And sometimes they'd say a reggae rhythm, and so I'd do something, I'd sort of set up a little pattern like this. If you direct your eyes down here, you can see I have a little grid, which I'll start a metronome so you can sort of hear hear the beats, and what I've got lined up here is a sort of basic reggae rhythm. So, right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, so that's a sort of classic dancehall reggae rhythm. It's kind of the national beat in Jamaica and has been for a long time. And one of the things that I like to show here is actually how subtle a change you make to get from a sort of reggae feel, which is related to the reggaeton feel, and a hip hop feel. So if I just take these snare drums here and move them over just a little bit in front of where they are now, you know, you sort of nod your head a lot differently to it, don't you? Right? If you sort of feel more of the 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, you get more of that backbeat. If we move it back over here, you start to feel the subdivisions a little bit more. You get more of that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. The way that breaking up the beat like that, which of course is, I don't know, sometimes just called an Antillean rhythm. It's really common across all sorts of Caribbean countries, and part of that resonance, I think, is what makes dancehall reggae so powerful in San Juan when it arrives in the 1990s via New York. And just to sort of draw the connection to the dembo beat, you know, another way of dressing up this dancehall rhythm is by moving the second kick to a snare. So I'll take away the metronome for a moment, and then all we have to do is add another kick drum on beats 2, 4. And we got the old boom cha boom shake, right? The dembo, as some people call it. For me, what was interesting about these moments is that, you know, the kids would say, "Oh, I want to make a reggae beat." And I'd say, "Okay." So I showed them the first thing I showed them. They say, "No, Spanish reggae." And I'd say, "What, Spanish reggae beat? You mean, well, can't you just rap in Spanish over this reggae beat?" and they said no. And you know, they went home and brought me a Tego CD, and I said, "Oh, okay." So there's, you know, I put a few things together and said, "Wow, this is really fascinating." From my own perspective, looking at hip hop and reggae, reggaeton seemed like such a natural step from there, where basically, like kids in Kingston, like kids in Brooklyn, you had kids in San Juan and in New York, also sort of, you know, negotiating these different sonic signifiers. As I got more interested in reggaeton and tried to learn more about it, a lot of what I was looking at were sort of message board debates, basically, and I was really struck by how fraught the discussions got around ideas of national origin, whether it was a Latin thing, whether it was a black thing, whether it was Puerto Rican or Panamanian or actually Jamaican or just ripping off hip hop, and you know, people would slice the map in so many different ways. So part of what motivated my research here was to try to figure out, well, what's leading people to make these claims? How can we tease them out a little bit? How can we sort of tell the story about all the stories people are telling about reggaeton in a way that recognizes all these different contributions, and as Juan was saying earlier, really gets at the profoundly transnational product that reggaeton is. So with just a little bit of remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about Panamanian reggae and Espanol, and then about what happens in San Juan and how it becomes what we now call reggaeton. You've probably heard the story before. A lot of Jamaicans and other West Indians moved to Central America in the late 19th, early 20th century as migrant laborers to work on the canal, to work on the railroad, and other projects. Many of them settled there, especially in the coastal areas, maintained cultural and family ties to the island in lots of cases. And by the 1970s, late 1970s, you started to get Spanish language reggae. One of the early groups, Renato and his 4 Stars, included a guy named El General, or who later became known as El General, who is really one of the pioneers of Spanish language reggae. And I just want to show one of the interesting things about Panama and the reggae scene there is actually how faithful oftentimes the productions are. That oftentimes they're cover versions. They're a Jamaican reggae song really using the same rhythm, same melody, and even the lyrics themselves translated rather faithfully. So if we listen to Little Lenny's Punani.
mami mami no me, bang mata tu pum pum, mami mami no me, bang mata tu pum pum, mami mami no me, bang mata tu pum pum, mami mami no me, bang mata después tu pum pum no me puede matar.
At any rate, it's obvious, right? I mean, you hear it's a direct cover version. There are some interesting things there, whereas, you know, Little Lemmy says tu pum pum nani nani, El General turns that into tu pum pum mami mami, so he maintains the sound, but he also turns it into a Spanish thing, and of course, punani, pum pum, putang being one of these Afro-diasporic words that's very, very shared. It has a cognate in English and Spanish. We also get them sort of disagreeing about whether or not the punani will kill them dead. However, I think by that distinction they actually agree with each other. They mean the same thing. El General's Putuntun, which is titled that way, I think, just to evade censorship. That's obviously Tu Pum Pum, was a huge hit. It was a huge hit in Panama, but also here in New York and also in Puerto Rico. And it's worth noting that this actually wasn't recorded in Panama. It was recorded in New York, where El General had moved to study accounting before he broke out and became big. And it was recorded with Jamaican musicians. So it's always already, you know, transnational in that way. And especially once it travels to Puerto Rico and people start to use the rhythm to do you know, local lyrics over, it changes a lot. One of the interesting things about how dancehall comes to Puerto Rico is it comes to it through the hip hop scene. You know, in the same way that we would go to a dance in Cambridge in the early 90s and the hip hop DJ would drop, you know, Shaka Demus and Flyers' Murder, She Wrote, Dirt's Man's Hot this year, and all these other dancehall hits of the day, you also had that happening in the hip hop scene in Puerto Rico. And so you also had hip hop style producers then taking their hand to reggae. And so rather than the kind of faithful translations that we find in a lot of the Panamanian stuff, in Puerto Rico, people started to, you know, chop up the dance hall hits and the hip hop hits of the day, put them together in totally new ways, and oftentimes actually alternate between a hip hop feel and a dance hall reggae feel. And so we'd have samples like the 45 Things 900 number. You guys know that one, right? Sly and Robbie's Bom Bom, the Murder, She Wrote rhythm. These kind of things would just get chopped up and rearranged in all kinds of novel ways, in ways that were still recognizable. You know, it was very important to be bringing all these things in. But what we do get that's very interesting, and I talk about this in my chapter, is I think we hear also very strongly how New York is part of Puerto Rico here. And my interpretation of this was informed a lot by Dr. Flores' work and the idea of kind of cultural remittances from below and the diaspora as source and challenge. So if we look at the Noise 6 in the video here, you'll see that we're not looking at, you know, beaches and so forth. The sets of images being used to represent reggaeton are much more familiar here. She's represented right there, and she says, you know, reggae respect Ivy Queen, and she's putting forth this very sort of strong image, but I also want to call attention that she's saying reggae. She's not calling it reggaeton, it's called reggae here, and that's what the kids were still saying in Boston in 2003 even. And so this is an earlier moment, and it went by lots of names, as we've talked about already: underground, dembow, melasa, música negra, and here, you know, it's really notable. What do we see? We see Times Square, we see the subway, we see the Unisphere, we see images of New York that are also images of Puerto Rico in a way, and that's important. The sort of story that I tell, which is, you know, just me trying to lend my ears to the way that I hear it, is that with, you know, the sort of increasing commercial viability of reggaeton, we also behold a kind of striking set of visual and sonic shifts, where to some extent we see less of this articulation of blackness through the music, and more of a kind of pan-Latinidad, which of course dovetails with, you know, demographic changes in the United States, corporate strategies like Univision, you know, adopting, you know, urban formats and that sort of thing. And I think we see a lot of synergy there, and I don't want to be too cynical about it, because I do think people genuinely can feel, you know, Latino pride, but I think that there is a kind of, you know, weird kind of circuitry between corporate interests and community interests, if you will. And so that's what's really kind of motivating my interest here, is how people are using the music and other kinds of images and stylistic cues to draw these lines, or to you know, that then people in turn will interpret these in different ways that draw these lines. So I just want to end with a more recent and familiar video to many of you probably, Reggaeton Latino by Don Omar, where of course we see iconic images of Latin America. We see lots of flags going by, and it was notable that some of the big breakthrough hits, not Gasolina, but definitely Reggaeton Latino and Nori's Oye Me Canto, were really full of this kind of flag waving, this kind of pan-Latin flag waving. And although you don't hear it in here, what we also saw sonically is an incorporation of bachata, merengue, salsa, cumbia, other kinds of sort of sonic signifiers of Latinidad that also sort of, I think, help with this articulation. So we'll just look at a little bit of this, and then I'll wind up.
The chosen few.
To sort of note that, you know, sometimes these exchanges are kind of painful when you read people saying, no, it's not that, it's this, no, it's not that, it's this, and people get very personal. And I mean, I think those conversations have to happen. So I think that's one of the things that I really find remarkable about reggaeton, is how it ends up really fueling a lot of these debates, but also facilitating them in a way. You know, I mean, there are a lot of hostilities as this country changes, and music often offers a very powerful way of working those out, of imagining new ways of drawing these lines, and for me, that's really what's drawn me into this music and to this project. So I want to thank again Raquel and Deb for involving me in it. I feel very privileged to have played the role that I did, and I want to thank you all for coming here and giving your attention.
Very much to all the co-editors and contributors of the book, and this is the time when we would like to hear from you. Questions, comments, if you would like to direct them to anyone in particular, try to keep them short so that we can move along and get some people involved in the discussion. So thoughts, questions, remarks?
I just have a question.
Oh, actually, one second. I was told that there's a microphone for the audience right here in the front. Yeah, right, then you can pass it around.
My question is for Wayne. I wanted to ask you if you could comment on how the production process of the music, and how technology may have played a role in the creation of reggaeton.
Yes, I mean, technology plays a very strong role in the creation and also the shifting shapes and sounds of reggaeton. In the early 90s, I mean, people were still using drum machines and samplers, the tools of hip-hop, basically. And so it's a very sample-based music, and that allows this, what I call a kind of indexicality, where people are making these connections to hip-hop and reggae, these musics very strongly cast as black, through direct sonic reference. By the late 1990s, you start to get this profusion of music production software, which was made with sort of different intentions. Oftentimes they're sort of these things like Fruity Loops, now FL Studio, were created as techno tools initially. So you start to actually see the sounds of techno and club and dance music seep into the music as the tools become more digital. And then you also see, with the rise of the internet and the way that a lot of these sounds circulate, in a certain sense, maybe that it contributes to a kind of consolidation of the reggaeton lexicon, because a lot of times now, producers aspiring or established will be accessing these sound libraries that circulate very rapidly and continuously on the internet. And so, you know, if you want some of these resonant sounds, it's very easy to access them and just to right away be making sort of reggaeton by the numbers. You know, so in that sense, we might also hear how technology has contributed to a certain kind of musical conservatism, even in reggaeton, which I think is a more recent development, although I think there's still a great deal of variation, so I don't want to sound too old folky about it.
Other questions, comments? Yes? Oh, yeah, can you pass the microphone, please?
Good evening and congratulations to the authors on this book. Nobody mentioned Tego Calderon, and when I first heard Tego, I saw that he really upped the vocabulary and the message in his reggaeton. What role does he play with this historical trajectory? Thank you.
You want to take that on?
I mean, I don't want to take too much. I think that, I mean, for me...
No, go ahead.
Well, I'll just briefly say, for me, Tego is like reggaeton soul. I mean, he sort of keeps it anchored in a way in this earlier hip-hop movement. I mean, he comes out of the hip-hop scene in Puerto Rico. He's really committed to a politics of negritude. And so he really sort of has kept that in the center, in a certain sense, because of his popularity and his wit and his ability to really project himself in that world. So that's my take on it.
And I also want to add that one of the chapters in the book, it's this really powerful, well, it's made into an article, but it was based on interviews of Tego, and it's called Black Pride. And it's a recounting of his musical experience, but within the context of Latin American and Latino and U.S. racism. So yeah, check that out. Yeah, by the time. I don't need the mic as well. Okay, or you can start off and maybe the mic can make its way to you.
Or I can just ask you this one.
Oh, we have somebody over here, and then we'll get you.
So I'm just curious, just to go off that question. Two questions. What do you think of the trend that certain artists are not labeling themselves as reggaeton anymore? So I'm thinking of Raquel Z and Ivy Queen, the whole música urbana debate that went on. Artists like Tego who will say, you know, I rap over reggaeton beats, but I don't consider myself a reggaeton artist. Or even someone like Nico C who considers himself more of a hip hop artist. So artists who are consciously straying away from the label reggaeton. I guess your thoughts on that, and also responses to people saying that reggaeton is dead now. And you had this really big boom. You had stations like La Calle who quickly had to shift up how they played music because they couldn't support just reggaeton and they had to incorporate salsa and bachata and all that. So I guess responses to that, because that's something that I've heard a lot more recently.
Thoughts on that? I'll start off by saying that now when I was in Puerto Rico, actually it's interesting that a lot of the folks who have wanted to see reggaeton dead and have been saying since before it was called reggaeton that it would soon be dead. One of the arguments for saying now it's really dead is that a lot of reggaeton artists are calling themselves música urbana, which, I mean, we were talking about this yesterday. Like, some folks say that if you use that dembow rhythm constantly, there's only so much that you can do within reggaeton. So it would only make sense to then incorporate other elements into the mix. But we were saying, well, merengue uses the same rhythmic pattern, but so much has been done and can be done with it. So is the problem like that, the mold, the rhythmic mold, or is the problem, you know, the folks that are making it, or the circumstances under which they're making it?
I just want to say, I mean, not in the book, but Raquel and I wrote a piece called Reggaeton Nation that came out in NACLA like 2 years ago. And I just wanted to say something that part of the reason that some reggaeton artists started disidentifying with reggaeton was actually the failure of reggaeton to become, to displace hip hop, which was the dream of a lot of executives in the US. So in that regard, I would be a little cautious of thinking about the trajectory of reggaeton from an authenticity in a space to kind of a sellout in a commercial sense, because actually that process of commodification of reggaeton to the US and in the global sense was actually a failure from the point of view of many, interest in having that happen in the US. So in that regard, I just want to throw that in, that I think it's a bit more complicated than a linear narrative that kind of only tracks race as the marker of authenticity of the production of the music.
I mean, I just want to add, is this on? No? I just want to add, because this question does come up a lot, and you see the sort of funny tagline for reggaeton run out of gasolina, that, you know, it's not present in the same ways as it was, you know, on, say non-Spanish language channels, media channels in the United States, right? We don't hear as much on general urban radio or see it on MTV and BET. But on the other hand, I think arguably reggaeton is more popular than ever, and it's being produced more than ever, both in terms of a kind of industrial, you know, perspective. All the same stars from 2005 are still cranking out albums, which sell very well in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, but also as a sort of grassroots phenomenon. I mean, people are making reggaeton in their bedrooms everywhere, you know, I mean, it's certainly across the Americas. And so in that regard, yeah, I think that the sort of the sort of worries or celebrations of reggaeton's demise are premature.
I have more questions than answers. I would like.
One second, because we had somebody else waiting, and then we'll come to you.
Okay, so here's the microphone.
No, he has another microphone. Now there's 2 microphones circulating.
My question is, whoever wants to take it. Since Puerto Ricans / New Yorkers were involved in the beginning of hip hop back in the late 70s in the Bronx, and that was before the black impresarios created a whole history and mythology around hip hop in order to promote it as a black thing. Is to what extent did the Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, when the reggaeton thing came along, did they see it as a way to reclaim some of that, if possible?
Yes, absolutely. After so many years of like that hidden history of Puerto Rican and larger Latino participation in hip hop, it seemed toward the later 90s and early part of 2000, 2001 that there was finally a mainstream recognition that hip hop was black and Latino. Like that became the catchphrase. So it was no longer just black, meaning African American, but African American and Latino. But that just seemed to be a phase, and then everything went back to business as usual. And Puerto Ricans and other Latinos were seen as, well, yes, you participate, but it's not yours in the same way. And I think that the production of a genre that folks in Puerto Rico and elsewhere in Latin America can claim as theirs, it's urban music, but from there, it definitely, I think, has a lot to do with notions of identity and feeling entitled, feelings of entitlement, I think. Yes?
Yeah, I would like to return to this issue of invocations of births or deaths of a musical expression, because it happens many times, especially when we invoke the death of a particular form, of a musical form. There may be several considerations, and I'm curious about why are people obsessed about it, saying, well, the death of reggaeton is a fact. If it's because reggaeton is really a label, or it's associated with some commercial firm, just like salsa was, associated with Fania, and just like Boogaloo, which Juan Flores studied, people didn't, they said that Boogaloo was not worthy of being heard, and it was dead. So, there are several considerations concerning that, and I have not read the book yet, but I would like to ask you, to what extent this reggaeton as a term is attached to some particular economic interest, if there are some, or particular labels, commercial things, and not so tied to a community, a given community or a diaspora of communities.
I want to say that people have wanted to kill reggaeton for different reasons at different times. Like, for instance, if you look at early, the Puerto Rican middle class wants to kill reggaeton. I mean, it's killing them to hear it, to see it. I mean, they want nothing to do with it. Later, when you start seeing that in the U.S., I think has to do with expectations that were not met. Marketing, commodification, expectation. In that regard, you could easily, in fact, in some work we're doing, we thought about naming it Reggaeton Must Die. Because that's kind of been, you can look at every moment of the reggaeton process of production and dissemination and track the discourse of who wants reggaeton dead and for what reasons. And I agree that it's not going to die anytime soon if it ever does. But at each juncture of shifting, there are people who want it dead, and we have to track who they are and why, and those people and those reasons change, I think.
And I would also like to bring in like the hip hop, reggaeton, I mean within that same generation, like, let alone the middle class or older generations, but the same generation, or people of the same generation. Some go with reggaeton, some go with hip hop, and there's this really intense battle coming more from the hip hop side. I think reggaetoneros, they do it over a hip hop beat, and it's a lot more free flowing. But from the hip hop side, and it's the same story in Puerto Rico, in Dominican Republic, here in the States, in Cuba. There are these intense rivalries between people who do reggaeton and people who do hip hop. And the chapter in our anthology that's written by Huelmo really speaks to that. This hip hop artist explaining why he just can't bring himself to do reggaeton, although he's sympathetic, more sympathetic than other hip hop artists towards reggaeton. He still concludes, no, I can't deal with it. So the microphone on this side, yes.
Hi, I want to propose a little bit of a question to all of you, and it's like I know reggaeton started like way back, like from General, Vico, and now we have like Arcángel, Joey Randy, and like I would like to see if you have now analyzed how the lyrics of reggaeton and the whole culture of reggaeton has influenced like the female aesthetic of today. I mean, like how it was back in the days to what is now, like how girls act to I would say to how they dress up today, how they act towards the guy, how they sometimes truly believe the whole lyrics things, and also I don't believe that reggaeton is dead. First, cause in Christmas, most of the projects they wash their money with the whole concerts that everybody throw up the concert, and they wash their money with that. So they need reggaeton singers to pay them cash. And also we have this other generation that is the generation of the kids that grow up with their parents listening to reggaeton. Because some of us grew up listening to reggaeton, but our dads were listen like salsa or maybe the Beatles, but there's like this new generation that you see the babies and they've been listening reggaeton since they're like before they get born. So, and I think that's the generation that is interesting to analyze, how that brains react, how they socialize, especially the females, because there's no female representation still, like Ivy Queen still singing since way back. Glory tried to make it and she couldn't. She's now singing like chorus. So I just want to know what's your reactions towards that.
I want to know what you think.
Well, I'm doing a project towards that, so I'll let you know. But it's like it's a theme I've been exploring, so I want to like put it in the panel just to see if you guys have thought about that or have something to say.
I mean, we've been in communication precisely. That's Sofia Maldonado. She's a visual artist, and she's one of the few people that has grappled with reggaeton dance and sexuality in any way. So I'm fascinated by Sofia's work, and in fact, I wrote this short piece called Perreo and Power, like trying to figure out how different people, the few that have addressed the issue, have grappled with it. And it's interesting that I ended up using Sofia's work as part of the paper, and this other visual artist, Carolina Caicedo, whose work is in our book, some of her images. There's hardly any work done on the issues that you mentioned, like women and how they perceive themselves, especially young women. I found very few papers, and it's interesting that from the dance hall side, there are a lot of ethnographies, like folks who actually speak to women who dance and who go dancing every weekend and have done really wonderful work regarding dance and sexuality and women, but parallel work still hasn't been done in the reggaeton realm. And the reason why I wrote that piece, Perreo and Power, is that I see oftentimes within reggaeton studies, people study reggaeton outside the hip hop and dancehall context and want to reinvent the wheel when there's all this wonderful scholarship that already addresses some of those issues. So I would suggest looking, and I have that paper, and I actually should put it up on the web, so people have access to the few works that have been done in dancehall, but that really serve to think about reggaeton in other contexts, especially like Spanish-speaking contexts.
I would like to pose a follow-up question to Sofia. And in terms of women's and gender representation, I really appreciate it. Your mention of Glory and like Papi Dame Duro and this constant, trope coming over and over and over. And I would like to talk about La Sista, because I haven't heard her in the conversation. And she has a video that is almost identical to Jill Scott's video, Living My Life Like It's Golden. She's like going on a bike down Loiza, so it's like La Sista. So and how invisible she's been in criticism and in terms of like media coverage. I've barely seen one performance of her that is public. I've tried to reach her. I've tried to be her friend on MySpace. I don't know. We have a disconnect. Las Crudas, who's a lesbian Cuban hip hop group, and I have been trying to get in touch when we were in Puerto Rico to do something with Las Crudas and La Sista, and it's hard to get a hold of. Okay, anyway. So La Sista. And in terms of the representation of women, but also I'm very interested in Calle 13's portrayal of women, because it like baffles me and it silences me and it mutes me, and I want to like take my hair out when I hear him, like Tu Maya es la gorda. I really contend with like the intellectual establishment putting him, in giving him like a little bit of leeway and not even mentioning a lot of gender, like really hostile, violent, graphic, Tego as well, highly homophobic, a lot of like, I'm gonna break your ass, el culo, y la sangre, and it's like really violent, and you know, there's all of that that I grapple with, and I haven't read the book, and I'm very grateful, because these are things that one thinks about, you know, and then like have them all together, and provides a different lens and perspective to really start analyzing. So it's gender in general, particularly Calle 13 and Glory, and you know, sort of like a woman's, where are women besides that little chorus?
On Calle 13, I should say, in the piece, I mean, I just read like a nano version of it. I do talk about what you could call Calle 13's porquería sexista, right? That is there, and homophobic as well. But I think, I mean, Calle 13 raises a number of issues. One of them is that different from most reggaeton artists, there is, in reggaeton there's lyrical universe, to put it somehow. There is an acknowledgement that men don't know anything about women. There's an acknowledgement that men cannot satisfy women. So in that regard, I would say that despite the porquería sexista we can talk about in Calle 13, there's also acknowledgement that doesn't exist in other artists, and that's why I think it's particularly rich. And the other thing is, and Raquel and I had a little bit of a conversation about this, about Calle 13 and La Mala, the duo between them, is the question of how do you talk about imagery that seems violent if it's contextualized as a surreal verbal exercise, and is the violence being done to the language? I mean, what is the object of violence in such an exchange? So, I mean, I'm definitely, you know, not defending Calle 13's sexism or homophobia, but I am raising that there are differences in the way that they construe the sexual space that allow for other kinds of questions to emerge than the Dale Mami or Dale Papi stuff.
Unfortunately, we're gonna have to wrap up this section. This will be the last comment, and later, I mean, there'll be music and there are books, and we'll be here, and there's comida. I didn't say anything about the comida because I didn't know if it had arrived, but it did, I hope. Que no estoy advertising lo que no es. Yes, so last comment.
I just want to say, like, you know, I listen to so many different music, and reggaeton is like one of my favorites. I listen to reggae, you know, I live in a black community, and they introduced me to reggae a lot. And like, I noticed that like, reggaeton's not dead at all, because I listened to a lot of it, and the new ones that came out, I collaborated with a lot of artists like 50 Cent, Akon, you know, reggae artists too, and it's coming out great music. Zion came out with an English song, you know, Tease Me. I don't know if you heard that song yet, but it came out, and you know, he's still doing great because he's still doing reggaeton. They did it with Zion Lennox. And me, I like Calle 13 because he had a different flow than everybody else. Nobody has this kind of flow. Even though it's kind of, you know, my abuela one time listened to it and she was like, oh my God, it's so pornographic. She started flipping out. But he has his own flow. That's why I give him his respect. Other than, you know, the whole degrading women thing, you know, I'm not with that. Pero, you know, que lo gente quiere, dale, you know? And that's me, that's what I think, you know, reggaeton's not dead. It still has its beat.
That's a really good comment to end on. Thank you very much. Stick around. There is a reception